The chaos began the moment I stepped outside and saw a neon yellow eviction-style notice stapled directly onto my fence. The words, "Half this property belongs to Karen," printed in bold letters, so large they looked like they were screaming. And right then I knew my peaceful life had been officially hijacked by the one woman in the neighborhood who thrived on delusion more than reality itself. From the second I picked up that ridiculous notice, my morning went from calm to catastrophic. Because only Karen, self-declared HOA queen, professional complainer, and full-time tyrant, had the nerve to claim half my land as her ancestral right, despite the simple fact that her actual ancestors probably had trouble owning even their own patients, let alone property. She marched toward me with her signature smug stride, waving a bright red folder full of badly printed maps, screenshots of Google Earth, and hand-drawn lines made with a ruler she probably stole from her kid's school bag, insisting that she had proof that my driveway, garage, garden, fence, and even a chunk of my living room were on her side of a historic boundary. I told her she was hallucinating, but she smirked like she had already won a court case. She shouted loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear that she had ordered an official survey using HOA money, and that when the results arrived, I would have to adjust my structures, compensate her for emotional distress, and vacate any land that does not rightfully belong to me. I would have laughed if I hadn't known how manipulative she was. Because Karen didn't argue to be right. She argued to dominate. The moment she left, I went straight inside, pulled out my father's old lockbox, and found the original deed, clean, notarized, and perfectly clear, showing that not only did my land not touch hers, but I actually own more land in the fence currently enclosed, thanks to a small extension my father had legally purchased decades ago. I smiled then, a smile Karen would have nightmares about if she ever saw it. But things escalated faster than I expected, because early the next morning she returned with 3 surveyors she had hired, ordering them around like soldiers while waving a new stack of papers she claimed were official authorizations. The surveyors kept glancing at each other, clearly confused, because Karen was pointing at trees, rocks, and random corners yelling, "The line goes here. IT still go here. Measure from this spot. And oh, this one." I confronted her, telling her to leave my land before I called the county, but she snapped that she had jurisdiction through the HOA charter, which made absolutely no sense because HOA rules covered things like grass height and mailbox colors, not boundary invasions. I held up my deed and told her the real survey, my survey, would start the following morning and that she should prepare to apologize publicly for wasting everyone's time. But she burst into hysterical laughter, the unhinged kind that told me she truly believed she was a protagonist of some property-themed soap opera. And just when I thought the circus couldn't get any more absurd, a black SUV pulled up and a county land officer stepped out, his badge catching the sunlight as he walked straight toward us, and Karen's face dropped for the first time. She rushed to greet him, babbling lies about historic encroachment, ancestral ownership, and a community emergency, but the officer cut her off with a single sentence. "Ma'am, you filed 12 complaints in 2 days, and not one of them matches county records." The blood drained from her face. He turned to me next and quietly warned that Karen had not only filed claims against me, but also against 3 other neighbors, accusing all of us of stealing land from her family line, a family line the county said had never owned extra acreage. He told me she was escalating, becoming frantic, desperate to prove a lie that could never be proven, and that she had contacted not only the HOA but the city, the county, even the state land office. Before I could respond, Karen suddenly bolted toward the surveyors like a wild animal, shouting for them to continue measuring, yelling that none of this was over, that she would prove it one way or another, and the officer side turned to me and said the words that made my stomach twist. "Sir, I need you to be prepared for what she's about to do next." And before I could ask what he meant, Karen ran into my backyard and started digging. Karen digging in my backyard like a deranged archaeologist searching for the lost city of Atlantis was not something I ever expected to witness. But there she was, both hands buried in the soil, screaming that she found something, even though all she had uncovered was a tree root and a family of terrified worms fleeing for their lives. Yet somehow she acted as if she had stumbled upon a buried treasure chest that would validate her fantasies and dismantle my existence in one swoop. And the surveyors, the county officer, and I just stood there in a stunned silence that felt like the beginning of a very bad documentary. She kept shouting nonsense like, "This is where the original line was marked, and the land speaks to those who listen." As if my backyard was suddenly a spiritual guide communicating ancient property wisdom. But the truth was she was spiraling, losing grip on reality faster than any of us had imagined. The county officer stepped forward and demanded she stop. But Karen leaped up, covered in dirt like some manic raccoon, waving a piece of rusted metal she yanked from the soil, screaming, "This is a marker. This is proof." Except the marker was nothing more than a corroded piece of an old sprinkler head that had probably been there since the 90s. Still, she clutched it like the Holy Grail, thrusting in the officer's face and announcing she was taking this to the HOA board immediately. The surveyors backed away slowly, clearly realizing they had walked into a nightmare, and one whispered to me, "Sir, we're not touching this job." She told us where to measure before we even arrived. Then they packed up and fled faster than mailmen running from an angry dog. But Karen wasn't done. She began pacing my yard, muttering calculations under her breath, and then suddenly she pointed at my garage and said, "That building is on my land. You built it illegally. I can force you to tear it down." I reminded her my garage was built 22 years ago with full permits, but she insisted the permits were fraudulent and issued under a corrupted map system. When I suggested she calm down, she spun around and jabbed a dirty finger toward me. "You think this is a game? You think I'm letting you steal from me?" Her voice cracked, and for the first time I saw genuine desperation in her eyes. Not anger, not smugness, but full-blown panic, like she was clinging to some invisible thread holding her reality together. The county officer stepped between us and told her she needed to leave immediately before she faced charges. But Karen shook her head furiously, backed away, and shouted, "If the system won't protect my rights, then I'll do it myself." Then she stormed out of my yard, dragging her rusted sprinkler piece like it was evidence that would save her in court. I thought it was finally over, at least for the day, but I was wrong, because that night, around 2:13 a.m., I woke up to flashing lights. Red, blue, white, sirens humming low. I rushed outside to find 3 HOA board members, 2 security guards hired by Karen, and Karen herself standing on my driveway wearing a reflective vest like she was some kind of nighttime land enforcement officer. "We're conducting an emergency boundary inspection," she announced, shoving a clipboard into my chest. The HOA board looked exhausted, apologetic, and deeply uncomfortable. "We're only here because she threatened to sue us individually," one whispered to me. Karen commanded her hired guards to measure my fence with a tape measure while she dictated official notes about trespass patterns and illegal expansions, even though nothing had changed on my property in decades. I told her to get off my land, but she held up a piece of paper and screamed, "I have temporary authority through emergency HOA bylaw 14B, which didn't exist. She had literally made up with a pen. The county officer from earlier showed up minutes later. Someone must have called him. And as soon as he arrived, Karen ran toward him, shoving the rusted sprinkler piece into his hands again, shouting, "Test this. It's a marker. It proves everything." The officer sighed, so deeply I thought he might collapse. He told her, calmly but firmly, that if she did not leave, he would place her under temporary detainment for harassment of neighbors and obstruction of county officials. Karen froze. The board members froze. The guards froze. Then Karen did something none of us expected. She smiled. Slow, wide, terrifying. "Oh, I see," she whispered. "You're all working together. A conspiracy to steal my family's land." She pointed at each of us like she was picking out suspects in a crime. "The truth will come out, and when it does, none of you will be safe." Then she turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving everyone unsettled. The officer told me to lock my doors. The HOA board apologized repeatedly. The guards followed Karen reluctantly. I tried to go back to sleep, but my mind kept replaying her smile. And the next morning, when I stepped outside, I found something that made my blood run cold. A fresh set of wooden stakes hammered into my front lawn, each one wrapped with yellow caution tape, and a handwritten message in Karen's unmistakable handwriting. "Official boundary. Enter at your own risk." But that wasn't the worst part. At the end of the row of stakes was a large, freshly dug hole, deep, oval, and big enough for something or someone to be buried in. The sight of that deep, freshly dug hole on my front lawn, surrounded by Karen's makeshift boundary stakes, and wrapped in yellow caution tape she must have stolen from a construction site, sent a cold ripple down my spine, because this wasn't just illusion anymore. This wasn't just Karen being dramatic or overbearing or power-hungry. This was something darker, something unhinged, something that made my instinct scream that she had finally crossed a line between obsession and outright danger. And before I could even process what she was implying with that hole, my phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications from neighbors who had woken up to similar wooden stakes hammered into their yards, each with notes accusing them of historic land theft and boundary fraud, all written in Karen's sharp, frantic handwriting that looked more like claw marks than letters. Some neighbors were angry, others scared, and a few were already gathering in the street demanding an emergency HOA meeting because they couldn't believe someone in our quiet neighborhood had gone rogue like this. But as they argued among themselves, I noticed something different about Karen's hole. It wasn't random, it wasn't symbolic, it wasn't even part of fake boundary. It was angled towards something beneath the soil, something metallic. My chest tightened as I knelt beside it and brushed away the loose dirt until a large, rusted metal lid came into view, round like an old storage tank or forgotten utilities cover. Something no one had ever mentioned, and something that definitely wasn't on any of the old property maps. Before I could pry it open, a voice behind me made me jump. "Don't touch that," Karen screamed, sprinting toward me with wild eyes, hair messy, clothes smeared with dirt like she hadn't slept. "It's mine. That's the proof. That's what they tried to hide." She lunged forward, nearly falling into the hole, and shoved her body protectively over the metal lid like a dragon guarding treasure. The neighbors rushed over, some trying to calm her, others demanding she stop digging holes in people's yards. But Karen was in full meltdown mode, shouting that the lid marked her family's original homestead boundary, that inside it were documents buried decades ago, and that she would expose every thief on this street. The county land officer arrived seconds later. Apparently, he'd been flooded with calls all morning, and as soon as he approached, Karen pointed at him and screamed, "Don't let him near it. He's part of conspiracy." He raised his hands calmly and told her to step away, but she refused, clutching the metal lid like it was fused to her. Then, to everyone's shock, she pulled a set of keys from her pocket, long, old-looking keys she claimed belonged to her late grandfather, and shouted, "Only MY family can open it." She jammed one of the keys into a small indentation near the edge of the lid, twisting with all her strength, but nothing happened. She tried another, then another. When all failed, she began slamming her fists on the lid, crying, "Open! Open! Prove them wrong." The officer told two neighbors to help pull her back while he inspected the hole, and although she fought violently, kicking and screaming, they managed to drag her a few feet away while she wailed like someone was ripping her life apart. I leaned forward and brushed more dirt off the lid, revealing a faded stamp. County Storm Drain Access, sealed 1974. It wasn't a family vault. It wasn't a property marker. It wasn't evidence of anything except old county infrastructure. When Karen saw the imprint, she went utterly silent, her entire body freezing, her face draining of color. She stared at the lid with trembling hands, whispering, "No, no, that's wrong, that's wrong." But then something terrifying happened. Her silence broke, replaced by a cold, eerie calm. She stood up slowly and said in a chillingly steady voice, "If that's not the real marker, then someone moved it. Someone HID the truth." And then she looked directly at me, dead in the eyes. You knew. Your father knew. Your family covered it up." I stepped back instinctively while the officer warned her to stop, but she kept advancing, muttering that she needed to restore the original lines. And then she ran full speed toward my fence, grabbed her shovel, and rushed to my backyard again. The officer chased after her while neighbors scattered, but by the time we reached the backyard, she had already hammered new stakes in the ground, forming what looked disturbingly like a large rectangle outlining half of my yard. And in the center, she had spray-painted a giant red X, shouting, "This is where they buried it." I had no idea what it was supposed to be, but before the officer could restrain her, Karen lifted the shovel and slammed it into the ground repeatedly, dirt flying everywhere as she screamed, "I'll find it. I'll find IT. I know it's here." And then On her fourth strike, the metal shovel hit something solid. A dull, heavy thunk. Everyone froze. Karen's eyes widened in triumph. The officer lunged forward to stop her, but she dug again and again, dirt scattering until something large began to emerge. Dark, rectangular, and definitely not a rock. My heart pounded as the shape became clearer, and neighbors leaned in cautiously, while Karen shrieked in victory. And when the last layer of dirt fell away, revealing what was buried beneath my lawn, a cold hush swept across everyone because it wasn't a marker, it was a wooden crate, old, nailed shut, and stamped with a symbol none of us recognized. Karen gasped, dropped her shovel, and whispered, "See? I told you. I told all of you." Then she looked up at us with a smile so unsettling it made my skin crawl, and whispered, "And now, I'm opening it." The moment Karen declared she was opening the crate, the entire neighborhood seemed to inhale at once, the air tightened like a cord ready to snap. Because despite everyone knowing she had been spiraling into madness, there was something undeniably eerie about the old wooden box resting in the dirt of my backyard, coated in soil that looked untouched for decades and stamped with a strange faded emblem, a circle surrounding a series of jagged lines that none of us recognized, and that certainly didn't resemble any official county marks. And while a part of me wanted to walk away and pretend none of this was happening, another part of me, the part now entangled in this nightmare thanks to Karen's obsession, needed to know what exactly was buried beneath my land without my knowledge. Karen scrambled into the pit, her fingers clawing at the crate's edge like a starving animal tearing at a meal, and the county officer shouted for her to stop, warning that old buried objects could be dangerous, unstable, or contaminated. But she ignored him completely, using her shovel to pry at the lid, each strike sending dull echoes to the pit as neighbors watched from behind fences, recording on their phones, whispering theories, some saying it might be an old well cover, others saying a forgotten military box from the 70s. But Karen didn't care what anyone thought because in her mind she had finally found the ultimate proof, the evidence she believed my family had hidden to steal her imaginary land rights. And when her shovel finally wedged on the lid, she screamed triumphantly and heaved upward until the wooden top groaned and cracked open, releasing a puff of stale, trapped air that smelled like rust, decay, and something faintly chemical. She paused, breathing heavily. Sweat and dirt streaked across her face as sunlight hit the open crate, revealing its contents inch by inch. A stack of old metal cylinders, long and thin, wrapped in rotting canvas and tied with fraying rope, each one etched with the same strange emblem from a lid. For a second, no one spoke. The entire world seemed to freeze as Karen stared down at the cylinders like she'd unearthed ancient royal scrolls. Then she grabbed one and held it up high, shouting, "See? Historic land records. They hid them to erase my family's claim." But the officer's sharp, alarmed voice cut through everything as he jumped into the pit with her, grabbing her wrist before she could twist the cap open. "Ma'am, that's not a land record container. That's an old chemical storage canister." His tone sent chills through the entire crowd as he explained that decades ago, the county used marked canisters like these to bury leftover industrial solvents before regulations changed, and that the emblem wasn't a family seal. It was a hazardous material warning. Karen's triumphant expression shattered instantly, her face draining of color as she stammered, No, that's impossible. That's not what this is." But the officer was already shouting for everyone to step back, ordering neighbors to clear the area and calling emergency services as he carefully lowered the cylinder back into the crate. Panic rippled through the street as people backed away from the yard, some running to their cars, others pulling their children inside, and even the HOA board, who had tried desperately to stay neutral, looked horrified as they realized the situation had escalated far beyond complaints and boundary disputes. Karen shook violently, her delusion cracking as she realized the crate wasn't proof of stolen land but evidence of something dangerous buried long before either of our families had ever lived here, and I watched her crumble to her knees, whispering, "No, this can't be." It was supposed to prove everything, as sirens approached from a distance. Fire trucks, hazmat units, and police vehicles poured onto the street within minutes, sealing off half the neighborhood, while technicians in protective suits examined the crate and confirmed that the cylinders contained old, unstable chemical solvents that could leak or combust if handled incorrectly. The hazmat captain questioned me and every neighbor, making it clear the county had no record of this crate. meaning it had likely been buried by a private contractor decades earlier, a hidden violation that had gone unnoticed for nearly half a century. As the scene unfolded, Karen was escorted aside by officers, not arrested, but held for psychiatric evaluation. Her face hollow, eyes distant, as though all the energy that fueled her crusade had been drained in an instant. She kept mumbling that the crate should have been something else, that her family history couldn't be wrong, and that someone must have switched it. But her voice broke into sobs halfway through, the weight of reality collapsing onto her at last. Hours passed before the hazmat team finally secured the crate and loaded it into their truck, leaving my torn-up yard filled with deep pits, trampled dirt, and silence heavy enough to crush the air. When the last emergency vehicle drove off, the county officer approached me with a mixture of exhaustion and sympathy, telling me the land would need to undergo environmental testing, and that I'd be compensated for the damage. But he also warned me gently that Karen would likely be gone for a while, placed under observation until she stabilized. I nodded, feeling a strange blend of relief and sorrow. Relief that the chaos was finally ending. Sorrow that someone who had been so determined, so loud, so infuriating, had unraveled in such a tragic, almost cinematic way. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky with streaks of orange and red over the scarred earth of my backyard, I finally walked toward the hole where the crate had been, staring at the empty space like it held the ghost of everything that had happened. And just as I turned to go inside, my foot hit something half buried in the dirt, something small, metallic, and cold. I crouched down and pulled it free, a rusted key, identical to the old ones Karen had tried to use on the crate. But this one had a tag attached, a tag with my father's initials carved into it. And as I stared at it in stunned silence, a single chilling thought slid into my mind. What else had been buried on this land, and what did my father never tell me? If you had told me even a week earlier that I'd be standing in the middle of my own backyard watching a swarm of county officials, lawyers, surveyors, and two very confused police officers gather around a furious Karen wrapped in a silver emergency blanket like an angry baked potato, I would have laughed. But the moment I saw her pointing at me with a trembling finger and shouting that I had orchestrated the downfall of an innocent homeowner, I felt an uneasy chill because I realized that Karen, despite everything, wasn't finished with me yet, and whatever she had planned next would be louder, crazier, and more dangerous than anything she had pulled before, especially now that her fake property claims were exposed and her illegal alterations to the shared fence had gone viral online, turning her into a local celebrity for all the wrong reasons. But as I watched her scream at the county commissioner, insisting that her late uncle's imaginary gave her rights to half my property, I couldn't shake the sensation that the real storm was only beginning to form, and I wasn't wrong because the moment the officers again escorted her away from the crowd, she twisted free, grabbed a clipboard from a surveyor's hand, and held it above her head like a holy relic, yelling, This is proof you all conspired against me." Even though the page she was brandishing was literally a grocery list someone had clipped there earlier, and before I could process how ridiculous the scene had become, the commissioner leaned in and whispered, "She filed something against you early this morning, and it's bad," which made my stomach drop, because if there was anything Karen excelled at besides screaming, it was weaponizing paperwork. And sure enough, not 10 minutes later a courier arrived holding a thick envelope addressed to me, stamped urgent, legal action, and as I ripped it open with shaking hands, I felt my throat tighten because the packet wasn't just a complaint. It was a full petition, complete with statements, maps, and a sworn affidavit claiming I had not only stolen her land, but had emotionally terrorized her by planting trees in a way that shadowed her soul. And reading those words almost made me laugh until I reached the last page where she demanded immediate seizure of my backyard for personal emotional healing, which would have been comical if the filing hadn't already been time-stamped by the court clerk, meaning it was officially in motion, and I now had a countdown hanging over me. But what unsettled me more was the commissioner's expression when he said quietly, "You need to see the rest," and handed me another folder, this one containing photos taken earlier that morning showing Karen digging in the wooded part of my property with a small shovel, leaving the dirt overturned in wide, frantic patches. And at first I thought she was burying something, maybe hiding evidence of her fence tampering. But then one of the officials muttered, "No, she was looking," and when I asked what she could possibly have been looking for on my land, The answer hit me like a punch because they explained that Karen had told multiple neighbors that somewhere beneath my backyard was the original property marker placed by settlers, something she believed would legally prove her claim. And although everyone knew she was delusional, the idea that she'd been roaming my property at dawn shoveling holes like a rogue archaeologist made my skin crawl. Because Karen with a purpose was infinitely more dangerous than Karen with complaint, and as the officers finally guided her toward a patrol car, she turned her head slowly, locked eyes with me, and smiled. Not the usual angry Karen snarl, but a quiet, chilling smile that said she knew something I didn't, something she hadn't revealed yet. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt true fear settle deep in my ribs like a stone, because no matter how many legal wins I had, no matter how exposed her lies were, Karen wasn't giving up. She was escalating, reinventing her attack with a new angle each time, and that smile made it clear she had already decided her next move. So when one of the surveyors suddenly shouted from the fence line, you all need to see this," everyone turned, and I followed the group toward the edge of the property, expecting maybe another sign she vandalized or a new hole she dug. But when we reached the spot he was pointing to, a wave of whispers spread through the crowd because there, half buried under the roots of an old oak tree, was something none of us expected. A rusted metal box the size of a briefcase, its lid partially exposed as though someone or something had recently unearthed it, and I felt a surge of dread when the surveyor said quietly, "This wasn't here yesterday," which meant someone had dug it up in the night or early morning. Someone like Karen, and as the commissioner crouched and brushed away the soil, the metal clinked softly, revealing old markings scratched into the surface that looked nothing like modern property identifiers, more like initials or dates from decades ago. And the crowd murmured as the commissioner said, "This might actually be historic." But what terrified me wasn't the box itself. It was Karen's reaction, because the moment she saw the crowd gathered around it, she lunged forward against the officers, screaming, and "Oh, that's mine. It proves everything," which made every person freeze as a horrifying possibility clicked into place. Whatever was inside that box, Karen believed it would validate her claim, and if she believed it, then she had either been told something by someone, or she had put something inside herself, and the thought of Karen planning fabricated historical evidence in the dead of night while crawling around my backyard made my heart slam painfully in my chest, because if she had staged something, things were about to get much uglier legally. But before I could decide what to do with the box, a sudden gust of wind slammed through the trees, kicking up dust and scattering loose papers everywhere, and through the swirling debris, Karen's blanket whipped off, revealing her wild-eyed face as she shrieked, "Open it! Open it now, and you'll see the truth you all fear." And the commissioner, visibly unnerved, placed a hand on the metal lid as everyone leaned in breathless, unsure whether we were about to discover some long-lost document, a planned forgery, or something far stranger. And as his fingers pressed against the rusted edge, preparing to lift it, I felt the air tighten around us, heavy with anticipation. Because whatever was inside that box had the power to either end this nightmare once and for all, or ignite a war that Karen had been preparing for in ways none of us had realized. And then, just as the lid creaked upward and a cold metallic scent drifted out, someone behind us gasped, "Wait! What is that inside?" And the commissioner froze, eyes widening, leaving all of us suspended in a moment that felt like the edge of a cliff, hanging above something we could never unsee. The moment the lid of the rusted metal box creaked open, a blast of cold, musty air hit our faces, carrying a faint scent of chemicals and earth, and what lay inside made every person in my backyard freeze in shock, because stacked neatly within the box were dozens of small, leather-bound journals, yellowed and cracked with age, each one stamped with dates ranging from the 1930s to the late 1960s. And the first thing that struck me was that these journals were all signed with the same initials, KL, the same initials etched faintly into the corner of the metal lid itself, which sent a shiver down my spine because Karen had never mentioned any ancestor with those initials. Yet here it was, somehow tied to her delusional claims about the land. And as I leaned closer, flipping to the first journal, the handwriting was precise, meticulous, almost obsessive, detailing daily transactions, land measurements, and notes about the exact plots of property in the neighborhood, with references to boundaries, easements, and even small payments made by neighbors to adjust fence lines. And what terrified me was that someone, decades ago, had meticulously recorded all of this, and yet, in the present, Karen had somehow convinced herself that this box validated her false claims, as though she could twist history to match her desires. And when she saw me looking at the pages, her eyes narrowed dangerously, a glint of mania returning as she muttered under her breath, "You think you can read it, but you don't understand they erased the truth. They hid it for a reason, and now I'll fix it." And the officer stepped between us, warning her to step back, but she only leaned in closer, reaching for a journal as though to snatch it from my hands, screaming that it belonged to her family, and that everything in these pages proved I had no right to my property, while I held the first journal tightly, realizing that Karen's obsession wasn't just with land. It was with history, with control, with rewriting reality, and that her delusions had escalated to the point that she could endanger herself or anyone who tried to interfere. And as the officers and neighbors tried to calm her, a sudden clatter came from the far side of the yard, where another wooden stake had been upturned, revealing another metal container, smaller this time, half-buried and dusty, and Karen's gaze snapped toward it immediately, her breath hitching, eyes wide with frantic recognition, and she bolted toward it, nearly slipping in the loose dirt, screaming, "No, that one's mine. That's the proof I need." And as she fumbled to dig it out, I realized the dangerous magnitude of her obsession, because whatever was in that second container, Karen would stop at nothing to claim, no matter the hazards. And as she heaved it from the ground, the container cracked slightly, releasing a metallic scent mixed with a faint, acrid tang, and the officer shouted for her to drop it, but she froze, staring at the contents as if seeing visions from the past, muttering names, dates, and phrases that sounded like codes only she understood. And when she finally tore her eyes away, she charged toward me with the container in her hands, screaming that she would prove her ownership once and for all, and I barely had time to shove the journal into my bag before she swung the container down. But instead of hitting me, it struck the corner of the old oak tree, splitting it with a loud crack that echoed across the neighborhood, splinters flying like shrapnel, and the crowd gasped in horror as Karen stumbled backward, clutching her hands, shrieking that someone had interfered with her proof, while the officer rushed to restrain her again. And as he did, the second container rolled across the yard, coming to rest into the first hole she had dug, and the lid shifted slightly, revealing a glint of something dark and metallic inside, unlike anything I had seen before, some small, jagged shapes that reflected the sun in an ominous way, and I felt a deep unease as my mind raced through possibilities, tools, weapons, old machinery. But before anyone could react further, a sudden rumble shook the yard, small at first, almost like distant thunder, but growing louder, vibrating to the ground beneath our feet. And then another rumble, deeper and longer, and the air filled with the faint smell of ozone and burning leaves, and I realized, with sudden horror, that it wasn't a storm. It was coming from below, from the earth itself, near the spot where Karen had unearthed the 2 containers. And as the soil began to shift, a thin plume of dust rising like smoke, I could hear faint, metallic creaks and groans, as though something massive and hidden was stirring beneath the surface. And Karen froze mid-scream, eyes wide as she whispered, "They can't hide it anymore, it's alive, it's awake." And I took a step back instinctively, heart pounding, as more of the yard cracked open, dirt sliding into the holes she had made, revealing edges of rusted metal and stone that had clearly been buried for decades, forming a rectangular outline that stretched wider than any single container could count for. And the officer shouted for everyone to retreat, warning that the ground was unstable, but Karen ignored him completely, inching toward the opening like a moth drawn to fire, muttering to herself about proving her family's claim, uncovering the truth, and restoring her legacy. And as she leaned over the largest exposed opening, I saw a movement within it. Not human, not animal, but something mechanical, angular, and partially covered in soil, as though decades-old machinery or some kind of sealed device had been waiting there, forgotten by time, and a low, ominous hum began to emanate from within the cavity, barely audible at first, then growing steadily, vibrating through the air and rattling the nearby trees, making the leaves shiver, and I felt my stomach turn as Karen, completely entranced, reached into the opening, brushing dirt off what looked like metal plating with intricate carvings, and I realized with jolt that whatever she had found was far more than a container. It was some kind of buried mechanism, potentially dangerous, and centuries old, left behind by someone or some organization long forgotten. and as the humming intensified, a sudden spark shot from the exposed edges of the machinery, arcing into the air with a loud crack, sending everyone ducking, and the officer shouted again, trying to pull Karen back. But she refused, her hands clutching the metal with a manic intensity, screaming, "This is mine. It's mine. You'll all see. This is the truth." And as her fingers grazed the surface, a part of the mechanism shifted, releasing a cloud of fine dust that smelled like iron and smoke, causing coughing and panic to ripple through the gathered crowd. And I realized in a frozen instant that the moment she touched it had activated something inside, some hidden energy, some long-dormant device. And before anyone could react, a sudden metallic click resounded from the depths of the hole, followed by another, louder than a deep mechanical groaning that sounded almost alive, echoing to the yard. And as the earth trembled under our feet, the neighboring houses shook slightly, windows rattling. And I felt a primal surge of fear because I knew, with terrifying clarity, that Karen had unearthed something far beyond a legal dispute, far beyond a family feud, and now whatever was buried beneath my property, whatever secret had been locked away for decades, was beginning to reveal itself. And as the ground shifted, again, a faint glimmer of light emerged from a hole, reddish and pulsating, casting eerie reflections across Karen's wide-eyed, manic face as she whispered, almost reverently, "Finally, they can't stop me. I'm the last witness. I hold the key." And at that moment, the humming became a low roar, the soil around the hole cracking and splintering, and a sudden metallic arm, or something resembling it, shot up from the opening, grabbing toward the sky. And I stumbled back, tripping over a stake, heart racing, realizing with a dread that sank deep into my bones that what Karen had dug up was not just history, not just proof, not just illusion. It was alive in a way none of us could have predicted. And as the arm lifted higher, glinting in the sunlight, the officer shouted. The neighbors screamed, and Karen, laughing and crying all at once, reached toward it, shouting, "It's mine! Mine!" And as the shadow of the mechanism stretched across the yard, I realized with absolute horror that the nightmare we had been living for weeks, months, years even, was nothing compared to what had just been awakened beneath my property, and whatever came next would change everything.